Okay, the TV contract has been extended. The ACC and ESPN are walking hand in hand towards 2036. We're going to break that down and talk about it.
Yeah.
Ira already has. He says, "Are they? Are they really? Hang on, just a minute." He's Ira Schafel, managing editor of Warchant.com and columnist for the article on Warchant, for the column examining what the ESPN ACC contract extension really means for FSU. That is going to be linked in the comments section underneath here on Warchant TV. And if you're not subscribed, I highly encourage you, $1 for a week and $1 to read this excellent piece examining where Florida State stands in the grand scope of ACC ESPN extension to the year 2036. Ira, I'm going to start it just giving you the floor for an open-ended series of your thoughts, any comments you want to make that echo your column from Thursday night, and where do you stand on where Florida State is currently in this predicament as the ACC and ESPN met that February 1st deadline and said, all right, the extension is a go?
Yeah, I think we just start right there. The fact that news came out yesterday was not a surprise. We knew that there was this deadline because Florida State put in their lawsuit. Up until 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we didn't even know that there was an extension to be made. The way the ACC and ESPN presented it back in 2016 when they signed the new grant of rights and the new contract, it was a 20-year deal. This was going until 2036. It's in stone. A lot of times people talk about the grant of rights and how it was ironclad, and this is till 2036. And then Florida State, remember, couldn't even get copies of the contract with ESPN. They had to go to North Carolina, send attorneys that they had to hire to go to North Carolina to sit in a room where they could not take pictures of the contract. They couldn't get copies of the contract. They had to just handwrite notes. And only then were they able to see that, actually the ESPN has a right to get out of the contract if they want in 2027 unilaterally. ESPN could have walked away in 2027. And to do that, they had to do, it was actually earlier, but the ACC allowed them to extend it 2 more years. So anyway, and then this was the deadline to 2025. So we knew this was coming. The ESPN's options basically were they could have just rubber stamped the agreement. They could have asked to make some changes, serious changes, or they could have scrapped it all together. And the reason some people were hoping that might happen was because the ACC went and added Cal, Stanford, and SMU last year as a desperation move. They wanted to have some schools in place in case Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, anybody else left. They wanted to have a conference that could still stay together and meet the contract with ESPN. So that's kind of how we got here. The fact that ESPN extended the contract isn't too surprising if you think about it. I mean, were they going to walk away from all that inventory? I mean, what were they going to air? Were they going to go reach out to Washington State? Whoever those teams got left behind by the Pac-12. I mean, they had to put something on TV. So there was a real incentive for ESPN, obviously, to extend it. The question is, what did they get out of it? And I think my impression from Florida State's standpoint is they're not thrilled with the way that contract negotiation went in terms of, maybe the demands that ESPN put on the ACC as part of that deal to extend it. So I think that there's some more stuff I think that may come out there that was kind of exchanged in terms of why ESPN was also willing to extend the agreement besides just wanting the inventory. But my biggest, I guess, issue with the way it was all presented yesterday was the stories that went out there, and they were leaked to 2 outlets that predominantly cover this case. Ross Dellinger with Yahoo has been all over all conference realignment stuff. And then ESPN, David Hale and Andrea Adelson, who work for ESPN. And the way it was presented was the ESPN has reached an agreement with the ACC to continue until 2036, which I think normal people, I think if you're rational, you probably expect. And then also FSU and the ACC and Clemson are still negotiating towards a settlement, is almost as if that was one news story, almost as if those 2 things were totally related and part of this process. I don't know that they're really part of the process. I mean, Florida State and Clemson have been in negotiations with the ACC for months. It was reported in September that there were talks about a settlement. So that's not really new. And even in David Hale's, in Andrea Adelson's reporting in ESPN, they didn't say it was, they said it was not imminent.
Yep.
But it was presented as if this is what's happening. And I think in a world where everybody reads headlines and very few people read stories. They certainly don't read till the very last paragraph of a story. I think people got the perception that, okay, this is all settled now. I don't think it's settled now. And, even if there is a settlement reached at some point, I'm not saying it won't be. It doesn't mean that Florida State backed down. I mean, we have to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, the language from the Hale Adelson piece says not imminent, and then the Dellinger piece says inching closer towards or inching closer to. But we were saying this yesterday on the live stream, inching, how far away are you? If you're inching closer to something that's feet away, yards away, miles away, kilometers away, you could be making progress, but nothing is determined in that sense. Otherwise, they would have reported it as such. Like, by definition, the moment that this is agreed to and ratified by the ACC, it's all set. But I'm going to take the opposite side just to ask real quick, Ira, why would ESPN, and I know you have an answer for this, that's why would ESPN agree to extending a deal with the ACC without, with the idea that maybe Clemson and Florida State would not be a part of it? Because then the value of that deal is a bad deal immediately. If they're going to pay out a structure of payments to the ACC, and then Florida State and Clemson leave, then the value of that deal drops precipitously for ESPN, and it becomes inefficient use of dollars.
Yeah, and I think that's where we go back to why the ACC went out and grabbed Cal, Stanford, and SMU. They did that because if Florida State, Clemson, UNC, Miami, whoever left, that they would still be able to continue fulfilling the terms of their contract with ESPN. They would have enough teams. There would be no what do you call it? It's not like they've fallen short of their deliverables.
Right.
By adding them, they cover that up. So there was that. I guess that was why a lot of people hoped maybe that ESPN would want to change the terms or something like that, because the way the deal was originally structured, they have to pay Cal and Stanford, not SMU. I think SMU's taken nothing for a while.
Yeah, right.
They were going to have to pay those teams, pro rata shares, exactly what these other schools were going to make. And that's why ESPN would push back. I think ESPN, from what I gather, I think they took measures to protect themselves if Florida State and Clemson, the name brands, leave. And so why that's important is it's not really a great deal for the ACC. And I think that's the point some people at FSU are trying to make to them is, you're not – ESPN's they're getting their cake and they're eating it too. They're getting their inventory. They're getting to, keep you in place for however many years. They're not giving you anything more out of it, and they're still protecting themselves. Like, you tried to protect yourself at ESPN's cost by adding those schools. They protected themselves by putting in some measures in case the top schools leave. So again, everybody's out for themselves, and I think that's, we all understand that. But I don't think, again, by any stretch, that Florida State's in a much better place today with the ACC than it was 2 days ago. And I felt like that's kind of the takeaway a lot of people had.
What you're describing here is what you wrote in the column, which is in Dellinger's piece. He says it's mostly the same. Like, the terms of the deal are mostly the same, not identical. It's not identical, the extension. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not identical. I mean, and again, the terms in terms of what everybody's making, I believe, is totally unchanged.
Right.
And I think that's a contention Florida State has is, listen, if ESPN's going to get some concessions to protect them, then give some more money. Right. And I think that's, one of the frustrations. And again, I don't have this as a fact because I haven't talked to anybody directly part of it I think the president is the one who makes the vote. I have not talked to President McCullough in the last 24 hours, but I believe Florida State was not going to vote for it. So it's not like this was, again, this kumbaya moment.
No, well, and this is something where, having been in some media circles, Ira, where I've cut deals in a former place of employment, reading these deals with, you can have affiliate agreements on just a smaller level. The ESPN radio level is a very small area compared to what these negotiations are, but the contracts look similar. And what I can tell you is, in the course of these types of negotiations, this was in the Hale Adelson piece yesterday, quote, value adds, end quote, the idea that there are these extra nuggets, and carrots being dangled to sweeten the deal, so forth with Notre Dame. And that Florida State, Miami, Clemson would be playing Notre Dame with greater frequency as a value add, or higher profile basketball games, men's and women's basketball games. So the network has more marquee matchups as value adds. When you negotiate, Ira, the AKA added value, this is what it's more commonly known as. if you are giving added value in a contract, that means you are negotiating from a place of weakness, because what you're trying to do is keep the value of the dollars the same. Here's some free stuff. Will you please keep paying us the same amount of money? To your point, that's the coded language here of who actually had the upper hand when it comes to the negotiations, and how do those negotiations come through. So
yeah, and that's a great point. That's a great point, Tom. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration, from Florida State is that's how the ACC has always operated with ESPN. It's always been just giving and giving, giving. And the point here is, you could say, well, listen, man, the ACC had to get ESPN to re-up that deal, right? You could say, what were they going to do? They're going to go on the open market and, see what happens. Doesn't seem like a great idea. But ESPN also has to have the ACC. They have to have all that inventory. They need this deal in place too. So that's the point they were making. And so, yeah, to your point, ESPN got to protect itself, in this new extension. They got to protect itself, which is important to them in terms of what happens if Florida State and Clemson were to leave. And then also they got the added value. They got these more marquee matches. So Florida State now and Clemson and these schools now have to play Notre Dame more often, which, listen, man, it's good for the fans. I don't know if Mike Norvell's thrilled about it. And there's no money coming in return. They're not making, I don't think they're making a penny more to have to play a tougher schedule than they were making before. So, again, but I think that's the root of it. And if I just say one thing, I think it's important to go back to the beginning of this whole thing, because Florida State has taken, and listen, man, we cover Florida State. So I'm looking at it from their perspective, because that's who we cover, and that's where our interest is, and our fans, our viewers and listeners' interest is. But let's go back to, why they sued the ACC, because there's been like all this, nationally, they've gotten all this grief for how dare they go sue the ACC, and how dare they, take this approach. The reason Florida State sued the ACC was because FSU went to the ACC. They went to the other presidents. They went to the directors of the ACC, and they said, we don't think this equal revenue sharing works anymore. It might have worked for the last 20 years where we all get the same exact cut of the pie, no matter how much anybody puts into athletics. And for years, the pressure was put on those other schools, the BCs, the Wake Forest, some of those schools. Listen, you got to invest your money back. You're getting this money from these TV deals. You've got to invest money back into football for the good of all of us. Some of the programs have done that. Some have not. Some of them want to aspire to be a championship program. Some do not, but they all get paid the same. So FSU went to them really in earnest 2 years ago, but they started earlier, but really pushed it 2 years ago and said, we think the revenue should be based on television ratings. We think the value of brands, and we think it also should be based on success on the field. Like those are things that, why can't we split it based on that? We're not just saying give it to Florida State because we're Florida State. We're saying use the metrics for who draws the most eyeballs, who's the value to the TV deal, and also reward success on the field. The other ACC presidents, the ACC commissioner, and he acts at the behest of the presidents, zero interest at all in doing anything for the brand value. They did do the success initiative for play on the field, which, again, it could mean a few $1 million a year if your team has success. FSU looked worse, obviously, because then they went and went 2-10. So they're not getting any success initiative money. But theoretically, they want to be, the team that's collecting that extra paycheck, because they are the school that they want to be at the top of the ACC. But they also wanted this part with more money for the better brands, because it's obvious. Look at the TV ratings. Florida State, if they're on even into 2-10 season, Florida State's drawing big numbers. You could have some of these schools in this conference could be 10-2, could be 11-1, and they're still not going to draw numbers like Florida State. Florida State's the box office draw. So that's why they in Clemson and North Carolina, they want more money. So Florida State had to sue because they got nowhere. There was nothing the ACC was going to do on any of that. There was no movement, no interest, go pound sand. So Florida State sued. Well, now here we are a year and a half later. Well, not a year and a half, but over a year later. And now there's talk of a settlement, and there's talk of giving the brands more money, and there's talk of maybe lowering the payout, the buyout if you want to leave the conference early. Well, those are terms that never would have been in anybody's mind in the ACC before Florida State signed the lawsuit. So I just think it's important to go back in time. I'm not saying that Florida State should settle, and I don't know that the terms where it is right now are worth settling for, but they think of the world that the ACC is considering now compared to where it was before they filed the lawsuit.
Yeah, no, it's all fair. 100%. These were not terms that were discussed before. Like, where I do get frustrated, you were mentioning that with, I'm not sure Coach Norvell is thrilled with having to play Notre Dame. Look, we understand Florida State's got to get better on the field. You could look at it in a 1-year prism, but I'm looking at it in a 5-year window, 10-year window. Florida State's the only program that has locked in Miami and Clemson every year. They're the only team, like, they're the only program that has those locked in rivals. So you're going to say, now you got to play Notre Dame every other year. That might help you with your brand initiative in that bucket because your ratings are going to be huge, but it's not going to help you necessarily with the success initiative. That just got a whole lot harder. And this league isn't exactly deep enough to produce enough good teams in this moment to where there isn't an express lane to Charlotte every year. 2 years ago, Louisville had the easiest schedule known to mankind. This past year, SMU's schedule was really easy, especially given that Florida State was down. Yeah. This year, North Carolina's schedule is a joke. There's always going to be a team or two that are going to be in that position if you're going to consolidate these Miami, Clemson, Notre Dame crossovers, which is a problem that I have with it. But I do want to get, the FSU side intel that you have, Ira. Like, I understand that these situations are fluid, and anytime there's a negotiation that's going on, things are fluid as to where you're going to come out on the other side. But as of Friday morning, nearly 10 o'clock, the university hasn't gone on the record with anything. I know they were busy yesterday at the Florida Board of Governors meeting and the things that came along with that. Where are they standing? Was this news to them? Where do they stand with it? Are they close to a settlement? Like, what things are you picking up right now?
Yeah, and I don't know if they will make a public statement. It's not. I don't know that. What could they say? It's not. Go ahead.
From a fan's perspective, could I interject what I'd like to hear? I don't know what about, like, the language be more refined and flowery, but like, I don't know what all this talk is about a settlement. We are continuing to vigorously pursue, our suit, or our matters of law, whatever it is. That I think people are wanting to know: are we capitulating here on the legal front or not? Where do you stand with this extension? I think that's what people are hoping to hear.
Right. Yeah, and maybe they'll come out with something publicly. And I'll push some people to see if they'll do that. I can tell you that they are moving forward with the lawsuit. They're not capitulating. I think that as it goes, in terms of settlement talks, that is going to. I think in the vast majority of lawsuits, this kind of happens. In fact, in the district court in Leon County, it's required. If you file a lawsuit, Judge Cooper's told FSU and the ACC, you're mandated to go talk to a mediator. Now, it doesn't mean you have to come to an agreement, but you at least have to have these conversations. So these conversations are common. It's not because you're in talks doesn't mean a settlement is imminent, as ESPN reported. I think where they're at is they knew this was coming. They were hoping. I think they were really hoping to get more out of the deal from ESPN. If they're going to make these concessions, maybe get more from ESPN. That's not happening. But in the big picture, Florida State still wants to get out of the ACC if they can, as early as they can, for as cheap as they can, because they want to be in one of those conferences where they can make more money. The question is, I think the what's challenging for Florida State, and I think what's probably important to really everybody look at the big picture, they're not in a vacuum. And so these other conferences, there's been reporting out there that Florida State and Clemson might not have any place to go. I think that was actually written in one of the articles. I don't believe that's accurate. And at least as far as what I'm told, Florida State is definitely presenting I've had multiple sources that they will have places to go if they go into the open market. The question is, when do you go in the open market? What share are you going to get? What penalties do you have to pay? I think from a fan standpoint, you want them to just break out today and say, sue us, and then go join a conference. But the media rights are still in limbo because of the lawsuit. So Florida State kind of has to resolve that before they know exactly what they would get in one of these other conferences. So there's one thing to know, if we become a free agent, if we get our media rights back, if we become a free agent, we've been assured that we have a place in one of these big conferences. That's one thing, but you can't really have that negotiation about what the revenue share would be until you know when you can get out and what rights you have, because they've got their own contracts with their own schools. So there's a lot of moving parts here. And so, and again, one of the things David Hale mentioned in the very last article, which I hope people got to, I don't know how many people did. And I keep saying David Hale and Andrew Adelson, I guess, were the bylines. I just saw David tweet it. But at the very end, he said, one of the discussion points now is with a buyout to leave the conference drop by around 2031, because that's when these other conferences are going to be re-upping their agreements. That's important because it's a lot easier for the Big Ten or the SEC to take a Florida State or a Clemson at that time, because now they can go to the table with Fox or who their partners are, and now negotiate a new deal. As it stands right now, if Florida State were to go in, look at what happened with Oregon and I believe some of the schools that joined the Big Ten, they're not getting full shares. They're getting like half shares because they're coming in the middle of a deal. And that was part of them taking the deal. Well, if Florida State could get their rights, but then now they've got to take part of the share from the Big Ten or the SEC, it probably won't be a full share. Now, would it be 60%? Would it be 80%? Would it be 50%? I don't know. And that's the other part of the negotiations and the math that Florida State has to do. So if you're not going to get a full share right away because you join that conference in the middle of their deal, and there's an option maybe to stay at the ACC and get more money, which closes the gap. Like, you aren't going to get the full amount from those other conferences. There's just no way in the middle of their deal. But you can get more money from the ACC, and you can get an easier out around the same time that they're. Then that may make sense. And again, I'm not saying that that's exactly what's going to happen or that it's what's ideal, but you also have to live in reality. And so, the other part of it though is if Florida State, they are continuing the lawsuit, and so if that continues to go forward and Florida State is confident that they're going to win their lawsuit in Leon County, if that happens, then the dynamics change again. So a lot of it's fluid. And I just, I think it's important to realize that it's not as if because it may not work out as quickly as people like, that doesn't mean Florida State doesn't have a home in one of those conferences and that they're not still pursuing that as the effort.
Yeah, I think what everybody's eyes are going to be on next, Ira, and we'll wrap it up here, get your thoughts on this. I think what everybody's going to be watching next is, you've said this a lot. I think you might have said it in the video today, but we've talked a lot over the last 24 hours that, everybody's posturing. And you said it in your column. Everybody is posturing. And so I think what we're all watching for right now is the continuation of the suit posturing, is the leaks that are coming from the league office as to, this thing's, it's not imminent, but, it's not exactly not close to being settled. And, these things are kind of closely tied together. I think Dellinger used the language that they're very tied together, the settlement with Clemson, Florida State, and then also the extension of the contract. Who's actually posturing? I think that's what we're watching next. Is Florida State, if we're here 6 months from now or 6 weeks from now, is the lawsuit going still? Or has there been an announcement of a settlement? I think that's what we're all sitting back and waiting for next to see if that actually comes to be, right?
Yeah, and I honestly can't tell you exactly what's going to happen. I'm not 100% sure that the parties involved know exactly what's going to happen. Again, it doesn't make sense. And I know we want to live in a black and white world, and people want answers. They want to know exactly what is going to happen and how's it going to happen. And if we don't hear what we want, then we're mad and we turn to a different channel. This is a negotiation and a lawsuit that nobody knows the final answers. So they've got to go through that process, and you've got to keep your options open. So the lawsuit continues as they also negotiate. And if at some point they get to a point where, again, I think it's a numbers game. Okay, what do we think the offer would be? Because I don't think the Big Ten and the SEC, even if they've expressed interest in Florida State, they can't promise, hey, we'll give you 60%, we'll give you 80%. They can't give them a number because they can't even talk to their other schools about adding schools that are in a different, we're not at that stage yet. So I'm sure FSU is trying to gauge what they think they can get if they were to join one of those conferences midstream versus what they can get out of the ACC. And at some point, if those numbers get close enough, then maybe it's worth it. The other thing that, again, at the end of the day, the biggest concern is that you remain competitive. That's what Florida State, the reason they were pushing for all this 2 years ago was not greed, as some people in the media perceived it to be. It wasn't arrogance. It was just they want to compete with the best schools in the country. And those schools in the SEC and the Big Ten are about to make tens of millions of dollars more a year than Florida State is. So that's always been the end goal. And so if they can get more of that, and then the other thing, we wrote about yesterday and, we'll probably write more about is the Florida State and other schools in the state of Florida are pushing for the ability to direct some money from the university to athletics. That has been off limits in the state of Florida because the Board of Governors wants athletics to be self-sufficient, and they're requesting now. Listen, we're not going to take taxpayer dollars. We're not going to take funding that we get from the state. But if we have money that we generate through our dorms and our parking fees and things like that, auxiliary funds that we can use for whatever we want, can we divert some of that to athletics? And so I think I'm not told that that's exactly there's a part of that here, but I think if you're piecing it together, maybe you don't get quite as much money as you need from the ACC, but maybe you can direct some of that money from the university. And maybe that ties you over until you get to 2030 or 2031. I get it. Nobody wants to stay in the conference till then. Maybe they get out in 2028. I don't know. But I think those are, again, it's like at your house as you're thinking about a home improvement project, or do we get this thing repaired that needs to really be repaired? But if we sell the house, maybe these are we all do this. Well, they're doing it at a much higher level.
Yeah. Just one brief thing before we sign off, just off topic. I see this in a lot of the articles. Just want to redirect here. Dellinger had it in his piece. The idea that the redundancy of Florida State and Clemson in the SEC footprint means they're not as valuable, and it's some kind of knock at Florida State. McMurphy did this as well last year. That is a talking point from the SEC as a negotiation ploy through back channels, in my opinion. And here's why. Inherently, you're proving the value of Florida State to the Big Ten.
Right.
So if you're saying that Florida State, you're trying to demean Florida State and Clemson's brand by saying they're redundant, well, then you would be a brand new, brave new world for the Big Ten, just like USC and UCLA, where that really is neither here nor there.
No, 100 point. And I touched on it in my column. Again, Florida State's very, very confident that they have a place. And again, maybe that's the Big Ten. Maybe it's the SEC if it's Florida State, Clemson, and North Carolina. Maybe that changes the equation for the SEC. I think if Clemson broke out tomorrow, they got the get out of jail free card. Do I think the SEC would just snap up Clemson? Probably not. Would they just snap up Florida State? Maybe not, because they do have Florida. But if you've got those schools together and they're not in North Carolina yet, then maybe there is an attraction there. Or NC, Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, and NC State, whatever it is. But I do think, to your point, the Big Ten, without question. The question, of those two, though, Florida State and Clemson, I think Florida State's more attractive to the Big Ten because of the state of Florida versus the state of South Carolina. So again, that's part of, I kind of touched on a little bit in the column, is Florida State and Clemson have always been super tight in this process, going back to, 15 years ago when Eric Barron was the president of Florida State. I remember talking to him about the Big 12, and he told me that Florida State and Clemson were pretty much locked at the hip in everything they did. And I think that's been consistent all along. Florida State knew Clemson was going to file their lawsuit. Clemson knew Florida State was going to file their lawsuit. Like, they have been together. But I think at this point now, Florida State, I think, is willing to go as far as they have to go to protect football and protect the university. I think and also they know they've got options. The question is Clemson willing to go quite as far? But, again, as far as it is right now, because you're hearing more, seems like from the Clemson media, you're hearing more talk of conciliation. It seems like to me. So, we'll see how it plays out. But it's a great point. Florida State is very marketable, especially to the Big Ten.
Right. Yeah. It's like, well, they've got no value. Then why is the ACC fighting so hard to keep them?
Right.
If BC was trying the same thing, how much do you think they would spend on legal fees to, oh no, please don't leave Boston College? I doubt very much. Ira, I look forward to continuing this conversation at an unknown date when we say, here's where Florida State is now. This is the future for Florida State. Was the board successful? That's going to be a fun video, but I don't know if that's going to happen in a week or in 5 years.
Yeah. And the last thing, because you mentioned the posturing thing, and I think you and I have talked off air about this a little bit. I understand the fan frustration of, you filed the lawsuit, you made it clear in the lawsuit you want to get out of the ACC. So when Michael Alford comes out publicly and says, we never said we wanted to get out of the ACC, that's frustrating from a fan's perspective.
Oh, yeah.
I get it 100%. Even settling, because the idea of sticking in this conference, even for another 3 or 4 years, let alone 5 years, is frustrating for Florida State fans. I get it, but they have to make the best decision based on what they can do and with the facts that they have. And again, even if they got out today, you don't know exactly what you would get from a Big Ten. So that's a challenge.
That August 2023 call, there are some trustee members that use very aggressive language.
Sure.
Like, don't condescend your own people, your own constituents. That's my number one thing. Because when you feel that way, that somebody is trying to tell you that they never did something. I got 2 words for that, and there's something I can't. I'm like, no, man, Ira, I don't like that.
I think their thought in the moment was they're sending a message to the ACC. What they didn't really pay attention to is they were sending a message to their fans too. And it's a great point. It's fair, definitely a fair point.
Yeah, the camera's rolling. Like, come on now, be civil about it. The camera's rolling here always on Warchant TV when there's breaking news and news of any kind in this regard, recruiting, and of course team stuff. As Florida State has newcomer interviews again, a series of them next week. Features with Dominic Robinson coming soon. A breakdown of Gus Malzahn on the All 22. All reasons to hit the thumbs up underneath this video and subscribe to the channel. Yes, sir.
I can't wait to watch that one. That's gonna be awesome.
It's going to be a multi-part series. There's a lot there. Dominic got his hands on the 2013 Auburn playbook, Ira. There's a lot to break down. So here we go.
Does it have footnotes with the FSU play calls and signals?
We'll see if there's a Damian Craig appendix where it's like, okay, in case you play Florida State, here's what to do. All of that coming here on Warchant TV. We thank you for spending the time with us to consider all of the permutations of what might happen for Florida State. For more information and for it to be put succinctly and to make you feel better about yourself in this situation, click the link at the bottom of the video, Ira's column on warchant.com. And if you haven't, sign up today. Largest FSU fan community. We will talk to you all next time right here on Warchant TV.